One of the things with software development in particular that's so interesting and funny is that it really is different at every company. Just doing the work is actually the best way to learn. And the more you learn about that, the more effective you're going to be, the more valuable to the company, the more likely you are to be able to get the job that you actually want once you get in. My name's Thor, and I've started a handful of companies. Most recently, Strata, to help people stay in touch. Sort of the lightweight version of what we're doing, but really, it's that relationships are in the middle of everything in our careers in this case. But really, like any project you do, anything you do for fun, even like generally, it's with other people. It's involves other people in some way, and there's these relationships that really are everything in your life. They're the lifeblood of the economy. They are like involving other people in what you're doing is something that we all do as people, and yet there's no tools to help us do it, which is kind of crazy. Relationships wither over time and they kind of go away unless you actively maintain them. And that's a kind of a key takeaway that is going to come up a lot, I think, in this conversation, because how you break into tech is really through that, through your relationships. And you have to figure out how to leverage your skill set and position yourself in a way that makes sense for somebody else. And the way to do that is going to be a lot of times talking to people and like testing stuff out and like experimenting with how to talk about your background and your experience, which goes back to what I was doing before at Feedback Loop, where we built a rapid experimentation platform used by over half the Fortune 100, really to figure out what customers want, what end users want. But it's the same principles that apply here. It's really around experimentation, rapid testing, hypothesis driven development, things like that. And then before that, started a healthcare company called Rally Health, where we were figuring out how to drive patient engagement across a pretty big scale. It's about 65 million people in the U.S. that use it. And then before that, I was in gaming and a few other areas. Made some games on Facebook that a lot of people played.
FarmVille, right?
One of them, yeah. So we worked on FarmVille, created a FrontierVille start to finish, and then worked on a few others as well.
So gaming, healthcare, B2B, SaaS, now B2C
Mm-hmm.
a bit. So you've seen quite a few different ways of approaching building out a tech team. And so, I'd love to, again, before we get into how you approach hiring, I'd love to start with your background yourself. And if you could share, how did you go to a traditional undergraduate, 4-year degree? Did you study computer science? How did you yourself break into a company, into the gaming space?
Yeah, so actually all of those things, but slightly with a caveat. So I moved here from Iceland and didn't have a high school education at all. The systems are a little bit different, and didn't realize that the word high school in Icelandic means university here. So there's literally just a confusion. So I went into the university office and applied to take some classes, gave them a credit card, and like half an hour later, I was sitting in class. Like the actual formal process um, was a little bit shortcutted, I guess. And then by the time they caught on that I wasn't a qualified student, it was too late. So at that point, I had enough credits under my belt. It was 2 semesters away from graduation. And I had just been basically taking classes and accumulating credits without being a student. And
Wow.
then they realized that, well, not allowed to do that, and they would have put me back in ninth grade. So that would have been the normal process. And instead, I did that. But as a part of that, my visa was such that I couldn't work. So I wanted to work in software development as a software developer, and wasn't legally allowed to do it. So it was a bit of a hurdle. But you're allowed to own a business. So as long as you don't pay yourself a salary, you can pay yourself a dividend, like a quarterly dividend or something like that. You can have clients, you can have software development contract clients companies like NASA and NYU and other like regular companies, where I wasn't allowed to work for them or at them, but I could do contract work as an LLC, and then it's fine. So that's what I did. And in a roundabout way, wound up working with a bunch of startups because honestly, it was more fun work, but it was more, more interesting, different things like that. And gaming was just one of those things. So we're building mobile games back in 2001 on flip phones. So it was like literally black and white flip phones. Like the what was it, Motorola T720? I think was probably the worst platform I've ever worked on
Wow.
for any product ever. So it's come a long way, but really it was just problem solving through all these sort of exceptional cases, and then started a couple of companies after learning the ropes, working with computers and software development in particular. It's sort of just a natural extension of problem solving. So you're trying to do something, and the tool for it happens to be a computer. It doesn't really matter if you're programming something or solving it on a napkin from like a dynamic standpoint. So like hiring somebody versus writing an algorithm are kind of the same problem. So step one, step two, step three, just go through the process. And there's a bunch of variables, a bunch of things that can happen. And if you just think of it as a flow, it simplifies a lot. So there's a flow of data going through processing, or a flow of introductions and conversations you're having, or whatever it might be. There's a lot of similarities to it. So just naturally gravitated towards the computer route as a way to like solve something bigger. Um, and then did a lot of other non-computer related things that are kind of on the periphery of it. So for a while I ran a consulting business where we were effectively building internet businesses on top of regular businesses. So if you're a coffee shop and you want to sell something online, it's easy enough to set up a shop, but like everything has to know about coffee, but you don't necessarily know anything about online retail and building a brand, building a community, building something beyond the physical footprint. Same thing applies in finance. Same thing applies in a lot of areas. Somewhere between IT and computers. The intersection is really where it gets interesting, where it's like behavior change, looking at how do you drive something at a really massive scale that you literally couldn't do if you didn't have technology.
Yep. And a big part of what we want to have in these conversations is considering what the future of education should look like, not what it currently
Hmm.
does. Because I think you just kind of nailed it. It's not really the most effective system for creating, sort of the next generation of technical talent. The future of education might look a little different. So, just thinking about those skills you just mentioned, how do you screen for those things when you're actually interviewing people?
Yeah, so the most effective I found is for somebody to tell me a story that's relatively open-ended about a scenario that might be similar. So, I haven't necessarily asked like, tell me when you've like struggled and overcome it, but something to that effect. So, for example, if you're interviewing for a product management job, like a technical product manager, now I would ask you to tell me about a time that something went really well and you're really proud of it, and then something that you thought was going to go well but ended up being disastrous, like some product launch that just totally flopped or something like that. And and lessons learned and things like that. And out of those two types of stories, you learn a lot about people, and you learn how they, not just how they think about their own experience themselves, but really like how they want to work in the future. And that's been a really, really, really helpful guide. So my most common question is just a general question of like, tell me what you've been doing and what you want to do. And often that's really enough to get enough signal where at least you can sort of then route them into different categories. For example, if you answered the question with like, well, I've never failed, right? I've never done something that didn't work out, let's say, right? That says a lot. And assuming this person has some experience, it is unbelievably unlikely
Yeah.
that everything has always worked out, especially if they're interviewing with me for a job.
Yeah.
So, um, all of us have decisions that we made that may have not panned out, and if you don't really have a good one to talk about, in many cases that means that you haven't really tried anything, right? So, um, in most companies where I'm hiring somebody, it's it's an important trait to have an open mind to look at a scenario where you don't necessarily have the solution and just figure it out, right? Work on figuring it out. Now you're going to get stuck, there's going to be issues, but as long as you can think about, let's say, an experiment to run, just to get going, just to do something, right? And you can try something and you can do it with an open mind, and you can then look at the data that comes out of it and then make a decision and move on and iterate and do it again and again and again. That's probably the most important trait that I look for. Somebody that has that as a mindset, where they're actually looking at something, it doesn't matter what it is, with some curiosity, and with a willingness to learn. Because if they don't, and I see this a lot in actually more senior people and more specialized people. So if you're a doctor, for example, you don't really want to learn in many cases. Like you've been doing something for 20, 30 years, and like nothing's going to change your mind. And I see that same thing in anything from enterprise sales to software development to a lot of like specialized disciplines where somebody's an expert and therefore they have nothing to learn,
Hmm.
right? And it's always a red flag, and every time I've ignored it, it's cost a lot. But I'd say technical industries are probably most prone to falling into this trap of being trying to be right, trying to have the right answer, because in many cases there is a right answer on the test. Then when it comes to working with a team and you have a coworker that might be an asshole, or might be, and might need a bit of help, you don't really know how to work with them. So those skills transfer across industry. So if you are really great at working with a team as a consultant, as a salesperson, as whatever, and you want to jump into programming, fine. There's a lot of people that want to do that. But it's not just about knowing the best technology and knowing the answer to the Google algorithm questions. It's really more about, how do I work with this person? How do I build the right relationship with this person? And if my skill set is maybe more suited for QA instead of software development to begin with, like that's fine. Just go down a path and you work with them and then you build it up. And the most successful people, especially out of boot camps that I've seen, are ones that have that mindset, where they're not necessarily, looking to get a job as a senior engineer somewhere because they have 3 weeks of training from some online school, but rather like they understand that there's a lot to learn. And what happens when you make that shift is that you start working on something. It might be a technology stack that's new or specific to that company. And then 6 months in, after you've been doing relatively maybe low level work, you are now an expert in that technology stack. So the person that's coming in with 4, 6, 8 years of education and 10 years of training, or 10 years of work experience, they just don't know the company technology stack as well as you do. So just doing the work is actually the best way to learn. It really is different at every company. Like you might have like best practices, but I'm sure you've heard from every single technical person you've ever talked to that there's some problem with the code or commenting style or something. Doesn't matter what it is. And the more you learn about that, the more effective you're going to be. Um, the more valuable to the company. The more likely you are to be able to get the job that you actually want once you get in.
Love that. I mean, it's the core of what we're building at
Mhm.
Workback is on the job experiences. And it's also the best place
Exactly.
to get a sense for work style and interpersonal style and how people get along together. So, for example, could you talk about a time where maybe a real experience where um, that story that you just shared you saw that in real life. So someone that might be an expert comes in with, and they think they have the right answer, but sounds like you've lived this personally, where somebody that's just more familiar with how it works and how the technology is built had the right answer, and the expert was kind of
Sure.
making noise. And any stories you can share there?
Yeah, I can give you two opposite ends of the spectrum where you have maybe a junior person that's had maybe one job before and reads probably too much Reddit, knows what all the coolest technologies are, and they come in and they're very vocal. It's like, oh, you have to. This is the best tool for the job. This is what you have to throw everything out and build it in this new platform. But there's always a new technology. There's always a shinier toy. There's always something there. And if you're a leader in that organization, you're really thinking about the organization. You're not just thinking about how do I solve this one technical problem that's in front of me right now and just chase after that. But that's always, and it's funny, but it's always what I see from junior developers. They come in and they think they have the answers. They think they need to retool everything and fix everything and build it in their image, whatever that might be. And then the opposite end, people that learned something 20, 30 years ago, then that tool set is the right tool set for everything. And then they have to go back to writing everything in assembly and C just because that's what that's what they're comfortable with.
How do you recommend people balance kind of asking too many questions versus seeming extremely capable?
What I would suggest is somebody that's coming into a new role to identify a handful of like low hanging fruit kind of tasks, and it could be documentation, it could be fixing something, it could be like if it's a software thing, it could be just like UI bugs that just have been sitting there for a while. So you grab those things, you can get them done, and then you talk to other people about those things. So it's not like I'm coming to you. It's like, hey, Chris, tell me about your job, and I'm gonna take some notes because like that's everybody. Everybody's wasting their time. But if it's more like, hey, Chris, like I'm documenting the onboarding process, and now that I'm coming on, I want to make sure that all the other developers, salespeople, it doesn't matter what they are, that they're gonna have something that they can refer to, right? And then so like, what are the things that I should read immediately to get up to speed? And what's something that like everybody in the organization, what are the resources they should have? Where like just create a document that captures some of that process. So then now when you're talking to me, even though it's basically the same conversation, now you're helping create something, you're helping move the ball forward, and both people feel good about it. And at the end of it, I've done something as a new employee that's valuable to the organization.
What makes a great side project?
For example, if you come in a sales role, but you've never been selling, but you tell me you had a surfboard wax business you got off the ground, it's like, great, tell me about it. What did you do to get your customers? Like, oh, I thought they wanted this, but they didn't. They wanted this other thing. It's like, all right, well, selling surfboard wax is probably not the same as selling enterprise software. Like the lessons you learn from doing it are going to be directly transferable. It's like, all right, so you stumbled here doing this, great. So now you're going to stumble here doing this. So you overcame it before, now overcome it again, basically. If you're joining a startup, chances are they want to see you ship code. They want to see something you've done, something you've shipped. So the most important is having something, doesn't matter what it is, that you can point at, ideally with users. Doesn't even have to be a lot of users. Just something where it shows that you understood a problem deep enough to solve it and get people to use it. And then if it's not that, if it doesn't have users and it's more like an academic project, then it needs to at least look really good. It needs to be really presentable and polished because that's how you're evaluating it. The technical underpinnings matter, I guess, as well if you're talking about them, but they matter a lot less. So if it's a side project, find something that people will use, show that you're solving a problem somebody cares about. If it's an academic project, make it look professional. Let's say you're building a website and you really want to learn just basic HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And you have a website that's okay. It's not very responsive. It's like, but it looks polished. It looks put together, but like doesn't have all the modern things you would expect. But you tell me you built it in Vim or Notepad or whatever from scratch, and it was your way to learn syntax and formatting and those kinds of things. Versus you could get effectively an off-the-shelf library, use something like React, and just do that in less than 5 minutes. But if you tell me you did it this other way, I know you spent a lot of time on it, even though if the end product isn't even going to look as good as what would take you 5 minutes to do. So it's about the problem you're trying to solve. And then if you tell me you built a web server from scratch in C with your own sockets and handlers and listening and all that stuff, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like, what are the problems you run into? Even though in reality you could have just used an off-the-shelf web server or even an online hosted one. You don't even need to do that, or AWS or whatever. So like if you're trying to understand the technology parts of something better and you do work at that level, then at least you have a story to tell about it. I'd say one of the most valuable skill sets for me personally is deep knowledge of AWS frameworks and APIs and libraries and all that stuff, because it's basically a different world. Like there are mappings from relational database to document database to caching, all this other stuff, queues and whatnot. But as soon as you get into any kind of complex architecture, like you are living entirely in AWS land, and like whatever you learned before is almost irrelevant because it's all about the features that they may or may not have and workarounds and how to tie them all together. Um, so if you're in a boot camp right now and you spend a few months, let's say you spend like 3 to 6 months immersing yourself in that and just spinning up a bunch of different tools and instances and trying it out, especially around like machine learning and other sort of newer libraries that they have. Um, it's pretty unlikely you're going to have somebody in any kind of job that has that experience. But almost every company that uses AWS needs somebody with that experience. There's a huge unmet need right now of people with meaningful cloud infrastructure and like full stack cloud, I guess, background.
Yeah. Good tip there. So, instead of, if you're in a boot camp or going to be graduating from boot camp, obsessing over the fundamentals of how, a computer chip is manufactured
Mhm.
and how that works, probably a little less relevant than AWS and how you can make use of that to
Mhm.
stand something up and put it to use. This has been really helpful to just hear your thoughts, and I think you've given some really practical tips for bootcamp grads, people trying to break in, and it's get going, start those side
Just
projects,
do something.
do
Exactly.
something. Talking about it is good,
Mhm.
but it's much better if you have something to share. And maybe that's a good segue if you could share a bit more about Strata and what you're doing over there, as well as how somebody who's thinking about breaking into tech might use a tool like Strata
Mhm.
to speed that process up.
Like so much of how this stuff actually happens is based on relationships. You might know somebody that knows somebody that's hiring, and that's enough. So your network isn't just the people you know; it's also the people that they know. And LinkedIn is okay, obviously, to map out some of that stuff, but it falls flat when it comes to actually building meaningful relationships with those people, and then helping them or having them help you in some way to get these connections going. So what we're building at Strata really is a toolkit driven from, think of it almost like a personal AI to help you with your professional development, professional networking, and really managing these relationships over time, strengthening them, and then making sure you stay in touch and some like relatively simple things. But then it gets really complex really quickly. So anybody that's interested in working on problems involving deepening human relationships with massive amounts of data and NLP, machine learning, and a bunch of other cool buzzwords. We're going to be hiring, obviously, for the foreseeable future, us and everybody else. And then the way to use a tool like Strata, it's similar to what we're just talking about, is that you just do something. Just reach out. And if you don't have a tool, then that's fine. Just write down a list of people. The first thing I would do is grab a piece of paper and write down 10 people you know that know something about the space you're going into. Even if they're not hiring, it doesn't matter. And just reach out. Tell them what you're looking to do. Ask them if they know anybody that's either connected to companies that might be relevant or individuals or Maybe ask for mentorship, ask them how you can help them, because there might be some ways you can do. You could do that. And then the other thing I would suggest is not forgetting, if you're changing careers, not forgetting where you came from, because there may be a lot of value in that as well. So if you spent 10 years at Goldman Sachs and you really want to get out of finance, which is a conversation I've had a lot over the years, then it doesn't mean you should just ignore what you've been doing and forget it ever happened. Because over those 10 years, you built valuable experiences and relationships that you might be able to leverage for somebody else. So you might join a fintech company that wants to work with Goldman Sachs. And your experience there, even if you come in a junior QA role, all of a sudden is super relevant to the organization.
How many emails would you say you send on a typical week where you're trying to pulse the network? You said 10 before, write down 10 names as a starting point, but that's probably not even enough. Yeah.
Well, it's a good starting point.
Yeah.
So you need to have, for these kinds of things, if I told you to write down 200, your people are going to freeze up and not do it. But if you write down 10, that list is going to grow very quickly. When I'm doing this kind of stuff, it could be between 100 and 500 people in a given day or a given week. That, like, let's say I'm trying to hire for a key role, then I'll send out an email like that. It's like, hey, Chris, like, in case you know somebody that's looking to do X. Most recent X was a meme marketing manager, literally a person who's in charge of memes, finding, creating, etc. Now, obviously, it's a content-driven position that has a very specific skill set that you can probably not search for in Harvard Business School alumni directories, but chances are you know somebody, or if you don't, then somebody else would know somebody. So we've successfully hired 2 people with that very specific ask, and they came from referrals and putting stuff out there, and being active on AngelList and things like that. So what I would suggest to the audience too is, like, understanding where the companies that you're trying to work at, where they're looking, and just be there.
Thank you again for coming on and sharing the words of wisdom. And like I said, I think it's gonna be really helpful for our listeners. I'd love to move towards the end of the sort of talk today, where we do these few questions that we try to ask everybody. And the first question is, if you could give yourself one piece of advice 10 years ago in terms of what to learn or do. You may have answered this already with the AWS question, but what would you tell yourself 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's what I just said to you. It's like understanding how to leverage maybe what I'd been doing in the past to move forward. Because twice I kind of made relatively abrupt changes, whether it's moving geographically or moving into a different industry, and stayed in touch with a handful of people, but not really. And, like, there's so many people I wish I had stayed in touch with from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that that pop up every now and then. And, like, for example, there's a friend reached out. He wants to buy a domain, or a GitHub handle is what it was. Wants to buy a GitHub handle because it's his company name. So, and they realized, oh, and there's this guy that that I almost hired over a decade ago, and just didn't work out. It wasn't like nothing bad or anything. It just wasn't a fit at that time. Like, it took another job or something like that. So now I'm sending an email. The last email was literally over 10 years ago, and and, like, all right, well, we haven't talked in a decade, but hope you're doing well. Like, it's just kind of silly. So if I had a tool like Strata to prevent those kinds of things, it would have been great.
Just to cement that for listeners, could you share a story, something quick, maybe for an outreach like that's turned into something?
So there's a guy that we didn't know. We were looking for investors, angel investors in healthcare. Had access to a couple of alumni directories. Kind of cold emailed. It turns out there were some other ties that literally didn't even know about, but they worked out. Stayed in touch and got effectively $10 million because of it. 5 million from them directly and 5 million from another partner, all because of a cold email from an alumni directory and then just staying in touch over a period of a few months.
And then last question for you. What do you think the most important skill sets for the next generation of talent to come?
Mhm. Yeah, I would focus on the things you want to do. So if you want to go into self-driving cars and things like that, that's a very different skill set from the Web3 stuff that's going on right now.
Yep.
So if you want to work on web architectures, then definitely cloud. If you want to work in automotive robotics, I know there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening across the board. Sensors, virtual reality, AR, all that stuff. Like Apple's coming out with something pretty major. Obviously, Facebook's in the space. Like that's going to be a huge area of development. And then all the crypto stuff is obviously a huge area of development. So each one of those things they're almost different skill sets. So pick an area that you're interested in, pick a problem you want to solve, and just work on that.
Great advice. Thank you for that. Well, Thor, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was fun. I hope you enjoyed it, and
Yeah,
look forward to catching up soon.
glad to be here.